The truck came first as a growl in the distance, then as a plume of dust spiraling across the horizon, blotting out the golden hush of the ranch afternoon. Tires groaned, gears hissed, and with theatrical arrogance, the vehicle rolled through, the open field as though it carried divine permission. On its door, a plastic badge slapped on with tape, a mockery of authority. Inside sat a self-anointed HOA cop, his sunglasses gleaming, his posture reeking of smug invincibility. The land beneath him had never known such presumption. Acres raised by calloused hands, watered by sweat and sacrifice, now shook with the idle purr of an engine that didn't belong. The truck parking there was more than inconvenience. It was intrusion disguised as law. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand like a sheriff in a cheap television show, his voice loud with rehearsed decrees about community rules that held no weight here. The family gathered near the porch, bewildered but steady. "This isn't a subdivision," someone muttered. "This is our land." Their voices were clear, yet the impostor smirked anyway, as though boundaries, histories, and family pride could be erased by his invented authority. His eyes scanned the barn, the eed fence posts, the garden rows, as if measuring what he could control. Each word he spoke was a stone tossed in a still pond, disturbing the peace that had taken years to earn. And there, fixed at the edge of it all, sat Grandpa, motionless. Wrinkles etched like riverbeds across his face, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat. From that chair on the porch, he had seen storms, droughts, and officials who fancied themselves kings. Yet the silence he held now carried more power than any ordinance, more weight than any speech. To an outsider, it might have looked like indifference, but his family understood. Behind that unbroken stare simmered patience, and patience on this ranch was never infinite. The impostor straightened, tapping his pen against the clipboard, prepared for another round of demands. Dust still hung in the air, sunlight cutting sharp angles across the intruder's grin, but no one on that ranch could imagine how far Grandpa would go when patience finally shattered. The stranger's clipboard flapped in the wind like a cheap flag, its pages scribbled with imaginary statutes. He waved it as if it were the Constitution itself, declaring violations no one had ever heard of. Unregistered fencing, unauthorized outbuildings, non-compliant landscaping. Each phrase landed with the hollow clang of authority without weight, and the more he spoke, the more the family's bewilderment hardened into disbelief. "This is a ranch," one of the grandkids finally said, her voice edged with fire. "We're not part of your subdivision. There's no homeowners association here. Never has been. Never will be." Her words struck against his arrogance like pebbles against armor. He didn't even blink. "Every community has standards," he replied, puffing his chest. "And I'm here to make sure you comply." The audacity echoed across fields cultivated long before a gated development had ever paved over a pasture. For this family, the absurdity of it all cut deeper than inconvenience. The ranch wasn't just acreage, it was history embodied. Their roots ran as deep as the cottonwoods bordering the creek. Immigrant hands had cleared this land, calloused fingers had built the barns, and generations had stitched dignity into every harvest they pulled from stubborn soil. Each corral, each post, each field row bore silent testimony to sacrifice. To have an outsider arrive, self-crowned in false authority, was an insult to that legacy. The ranch was sanctuary, a place where identity was not just remembered but lived out daily. For Grandpa, it stood as a promise that sweat could shape freedom, That standing tall on one's own soil meant dignity. No outside voice could strip away. This was why each invented rule the man rattled off sounded not simply foolish, but sacrilegious. He wasn't citing codes, he was desecrating stories. And still, the intruder pushed further. He criticized the hand-painted sign carved decades, Ego by Grandpa himself. He mocked the vegetable rows for being non-conforming. He scoffed at the weathered barn, calling it unsafe by standard guidelines. The air around him pulsed with smugness, a parody of power dressed in cheap authority. What he failed to see, what he could never measure on his clipboard, was that this wasn't just property. It was resilience in wooden beams, courage in each scar of the earth, and identity embedded so deep that no ordinance could uproot it. By trespassing here, he wasn't merely misusing rules. He was trespassing on dignity. And dignity, once threatened, does not yield quietly. The family's voices rose louder now, unity growing as insult stacked upon insult. Yet Grandpa remained motionless, gaze steady, jaw set. His silence pressed, heavier than their words, a tightening gravity around the scene. The children glanced at him, unsure if he would sit idle, unsure if his endurance meant restraint, or the kind of endurance that waits for the right moment to strike. The fake officer laughed, mistaking calm for defeat. He turned back to scribble on his paper, a smirk tugging at his mouth as though he thought the ranch was already his. And then, in that quiet tension, Grandpa's silence began to feel less like surrender, and more like strategy. Long before, his truck churned up the dust on Grandpa's ranch. The so-called HOA cop was already a man consumed by his own frustrations. His name, spoken rarely with affection and often with irritation, carried with it an aura of disappointment. In every crowd, he was the one too eager for control, too desperate to be noticed, and too incapable of earning true respect. This was not a man of stature, but of shadows, lingering at the edges of community halls, raising his hand too often, volunteering for positions others politely declined. Once, he had found the crown jewel of his ambitions, a seat on the local homeowners association. It was a modest suburban board, a collection of neighbors deciding lawn heights and mailbox colors. But for him, it was his personal White House. His clipboard became his constitution, his laminated name tag, his badge of honor. He relished telling families to take down mismatched curtains or repaint fences. Power, however trivial, became nourishment to a starving ego. But even in that small pond, his arrogance burned too bright. The neighbors grew tired of his zeal for punishment, his endless citations, his constant patrols around cul-de-sacs as if they were sacred battlegrounds. Letters poured in, not from violators, but from families pleading for peace. Eventually, his fellow board members voted him off, the first time anyone in their modest community had ever been expelled. His humiliation was complete, but instead of reflection, he chose reinvention. He began styling himself as an independent enforcer, declaring he was still authorized. By what office? No one could say. He bought reflective sunglasses, a DBC Tudrig, navy shirt stuffed with fake patches, and an official-looking clipboard stamped with self-made insignias. For anyone too timid to push back, he was the law incarnate. And so he roamed the county roads, seeking places to impose his control, chasing the illusion that he was more than a middle-aged man reduced by failure. Yet in his quest for validation, he ventured beyond suburbs into farmlands he could neither understand nor respect. Culture, heritage, identity, all currents that ran deeper than his shallow grasp of order, were invisible to him. What mattered was only the echo of his own voice, loud enough to convince himself he held authority. Without respect, fear was the only tool left. He wielded it clumsily, mistaking compliance for legitimacy. The irony was stark when viewed against the American story he presumed to represent. He fashioned himself as guardian of rules, yet his rules were self-invented. He postured as a defender of community, when in truth he fractured every community he touched. He was the portrait of the small man, grasping at control, not because he deserved it, but because his own failures drowned him. He didn't lead by example. He cornered by intimidation. And standing across from him, silent on the porch, was Grandpa, a man who represented the exact opposite of everything the imposter embodied. Where the fake cop spun fantasies of authority, Grandpa held the real weight of legacy earned by decades of labor. Where the intruder relied on arrogance, Grandpa wore humility like armor. Where the enforcer's voice was loud but empty, Grandpa's silence carried the gravity of storms past, and wisdom accumulated over a lifetime. The juxtaposition was almost cinematic. Two men separated not simply by age, but by diametric values. One thrashing for scraps of borrowed dignity, the other embodying real dignity in every weathered wrinkle of his face. The adversary arrived, with a philosophy of control, but Grandpa's very existence was a rebuttal. That true authority is not demanded, it is lived. Neighbors often say that bullies are not born, they are made, fueled by disappointments, sharpened by rejection. And certainly this HOA officer was no exception. Rejected by neighbors, ignored by colleagues, dismissed by peers, he built a fantasy world where rules bent to his desire, and every infraction restored a piece of the control life had denied him. His invented position was not an eccentric quirk. It was desperation in uniform. Yet right there, in the dirt road that cut across Grandpa's property, his fantasy now clashed with reality. Dust from his truck wheels lingered like smoke from a cannon, and his clipboard shook with the force of his exaggerated breath. Every complaint he scribbled was less about barn paint or fences. It was an attempt to drown his irrelevance beneath layers of bureaucracy. And the more he felt irrelevant, the louder his arrogance grew. But what he could not measure, what no page of citations could capture, was the presence of the man on the porch. Grandpa did not boast. He did not rattle off laws or shout. He looked upon the bluster with eyes that saw not a ruler, but a child playing dress-up, rehearsing power he had never earned. To the enforcer, it felt like defiance. To the family, it felt like inevitability, that storm clouds were gathering just behind Grandpa's silence. But while the man's arrogance grew louder, Grandpa's legacy whispered louder still. Before the man in the fake uniform ever pointed a clipboard toward the barn, before the tires of his truck scarred the pasture grass, Grandpa had lived a life carved out of labor, tenacity, and sacrifice. His story did not begin on this ranch. It began far from here, with immigrant roots that carried both hardship and hope. Born into a family who came to America with little more than calloused hands, patched clothing, and an unshakable belief that a better tomorrow could actually be built, he understood from childhood that land was not merely property. Land was proof. Proof you belonged, proof you endured, proof you had wrestled a place for yourself in a world that had not been designed to welcome you. Grandpa was never a man who talked much about his youth, but if you piece together the fragments, the stories, shared in low voices at family tables, the scars across his hands, the way he slowed whenever passing the fence line, you could glimpse the truth. As a boy, he had labored in fields that did not belong to him, pulling weeds from soil whose harvest he would never taste. As a young man, he had taken jobs no one wanted, lifting, hammering, carrying, until his back ached, because dignity did not come free. It demanded sweat as its down payment. Yet, through every season of struggle, he carried with him a private vow. One day, his family would stand on land that owed nothing to anyone else. That vow found its expression in this ranch. Piece by piece, acre by acre, he made it real. The hard first plots came cheap because no one else saw their worth. They were wild undergrowth and stubborn clay, fields filled with rocks that resisted the plow. But Grandpa's stubbornness ran deeper than stone, and his vision saw what others missed. He cleared brush, hammered fence posts, and coaxed soil into giving life where none seemed possible. Bruised knuckles and torn boots were his signature on the deed. Every structure here was built by his hands, or paid for by labor that wore his bones thinner. And yet, despite the physical toll, his shoulders stiffening with age, his gait slowing with pain, there was no bitterness in him. Pride, yes, but never arrogance. The family grew up with the quiet example of a man who did not need to shout about what he had built. He lived it, step by weary step. For the younger ones, his lessons were not speeches, but actions. When he rose before dawn, they learned consistency. When he repaired old tools instead of buying shiny new ones, they learned resourcefulness. When he showed respect to neighboring farmers, even those who treated him as an outsider for his accent or his lineage, they learned dignity. The ranch carried immigrant fingerprints in every corner, the wooden gate carved with initials, the orchard planted with care, the shed re-roofed after storms with whatever material could be salvaged. It all reflected both the wounds and the resilience of roots that had traveled oceans. Young workers, who came to help during summer breaks, often left profoundly changed. Some carried forward the memory of Grandpa's pace, steady and disciplined, into their own futures. To them, he was less an employer and more a mentor, a walking reminder that work tied to something larger than yourself could be sacred. Inside the family, his presence shaped entire generations. Children learned responsibility not through lectures, but through planting seeds and digging fence holes beside him. Teenagers who once rolled their eyes at chores found themselves repeating his quiet phrases years later. Work doesn't complain about being heavy. You either lift it or you leave it for someone else. His essence lived not only in the land but in the people he raised. What outsiders often mistook for stoicism was, in fact, his deepest pride. He could look across each acre and see more than soil. He could see his youth poured out, his struggles redeemed, his family's place secured. Every fence post was hammered by endurance. Every gate was fastened by sacrifice. He never once needed to prove ownership with words, because ownership had been welded across decades of living. This was his cathedral, painted not in stained glass, but in sunsets, over wheat fields. To understand Grandpa was to understand that dignity was never an accident. It was forged, and that was why the insults of the fake cop cut against him more than the intruder could comprehend. To dismiss his barn as unsafe was to mock the nights spent working until his palms bled. To call his vegetable rows non-compliant was to erase the immigrant knowledge that had fed his family when wages couldn't. To question his independence was not simply arrogance, it was sacrilege, because this ranch was not just a backdrop to life. It was life itself, manifest in wood, stone, and soil. The pride here was not vanity. It was survival turned into permanence. He embodied not only his own story, but every story of those who came before, those who dreamed with empty pockets and built futures with battered hands. He carried that weight on bent shoulders and stood taller for it, so, when the truck roared back onto their land as if it owned the soil, it wasn't just trespassing. It touched the very nerve of everything Grandpa had bled to build. The air that afternoon carried a stillness so sharp it could cut. The truck was parked boldly in the center of the field, its engine ticking in defiance, while the man in fake uniform strutted toward the porch. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses glinting, he looked like a parody of power, but his tone was deadly, serious. He planted his boots as though staking new land and began reciting, line after fabricated line, the rules he swore governed this place. Article 3, Non-Compliant Structures, he barked. Section 7, Failure to maintain approved landscaping. Section 9, Unregistered livestock. His voice rattled through the hot air, each claim sounding more absurd than the last. To the family on the porch, the jargon meant nothing, but to the man wielding it, it was ammunition. Every invented statute was another way of declaring, "You don't belong here." The younger members of the family stirred restlessly. Some wanted to call his bluff, to laugh at the nonsense of unregistered chickens, or the audacity of labeling wild prairie non-compliant grass. Others clenched their fists, anger at the man's tone swelling in their throats. He wasn't just insulting a barn or a garden trellis, he was diminishing what had taken generations to build. The restraint it took to remain quiet was a storm, in their chests. But on the porch, Grandpa did not move. He didn't rise to meet the man's gaze, didn't exchange a single word. His silence, steady and unbroken, seemed almost to rattle the intruder more than any outburst could. The fake officer raised his voice louder, mistaking patience for weakness. His bravado grew reckless, his insults sharper. "This setup isn't up to standard," he scoffed, pointing his pen at the barn. "It's an eyesore, probably unsafe. People like you can't just live however you please, without rules. That's not how communities thrive. This isn't the Wild West." The words lingered heavy. People like you. A phrase loaded, deliberate or not, with the venom that families who had once been outsiders knew too well. It was a phrase that echoed across history, hurled at immigrants told to conform, at communities told to keep quiet, at workers told their sweat earned them nothing but suspicion. On this day, it was aimed at Grandpa, but its poison fell on them all. The family bristled. To them, this wasn't simply a man ranting about regulations, it was every slight they'd absorbed from authority figures who never respected their dignity. The insults crackled like kindling, pushing voices to the edge of shouting. Still, Grandpa remained still. He leaned forward, just slightly in his chair, his weathered hat shadowing his eyes. One hand rested on the armrest, steady as stone. The man's arrogance swelled in the silence he misread. He strutted across the dirt, barking into the dry wind. "This isn't negotiable. You either start meeting compliance, or there will be consequences. You can't refuse authority forever." His clip of words cut sharper than the cheap pen he clutched. A performance meant to intimidate, but intimidation requires submission to succeed. And Grandpa did not bend. His silence wasn't compliance. It was endurance. He sat like granite, carrying not just his own history, but the histories of those before him. Voices silenced in ships, workers ignored in fields, families dismissed in council halls. His stillness became its own kind of defiance. The family's eyes darted toward him, frustration and reverence colliding in their chests. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why wasn't he pushing back? They wanted to shout him down, to defend their right to live, to call out the blatant lies. But alongside their impatience was trust. They had seen before how Grandpa's calm was not surrender, but gathering strength. When his silence broke, it never broke lightly. The intruder smirked, confident he had cowed them all. He made one final flourish with his clipboard, slapping the papers against its board like the gavel of a judge. "I expect compliance by the end of the week, or I'll make sure this property faces serious repercussions." Dust swirled in the late afternoon light. The family's anger quivered on the edge of eruption. The imposter believed he had won. But on the porch, Grandpa's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed with the stillness of a man who had reached the end of waiting. And then, patience ended. The confrontation reached its breaking point in silence. Not the silence of fear, not the awkward hush of people unsure, but the kind of silence that coils tight, like a bow just waiting for its string to snap. The intruder felt triumphant standing there, with his clipboard and imaginary decrees. He mistook stillness for surrender, mistook patience for defeat. But patience is only powerful until the moment it tears, and on this ranch, that moment had come. Grandpa rose from his chair without hurry, the way storms rise on the horizon without fanfare. His boots hit the wood of the porch with a steady thud. The family, tense and seething, quieted, as though some sacred signal had been given. Eyes followed every movement as Grandpa crossed the porch, walked past the stew of insults still dripping from the self-declared officer's mouth, and disappeared into the shadows of the tool shed. The man chuckled, mocking. "Finally going to fix your violations?" he sneered, tapping his pen against the clipboard like a judge awaiting plea. He didn't know Grandpa. He didn't even understand the weight of the silence he'd just broken. When Grandpa returned, he carried a coil of chain, thick links clanging with the music of inevitability. It swung heavy in his hand, sunlight dancing along its metal, as if reflecting an unbroken line of legacy stretching back generations. Each clang against his boots was its own declaration. This was no longer a game, no imaginary ruling, no false law. This was resistance, and it was forged in steel. The family exchanged knowing glances, breaths caught between anticipation and awe. The intruder's smile faltered, uncertainty flickering behind his sunglasses. "Now, what's this about?" he asked, his bravado thinning. Grandpa didn't answer. He didn't argue. Words, after all, had never been his weapon. Dignity itself was his language, and action would be his punctuation. Without pause, he strode past the sputtering enforcer, bent low, and slid the steel links under the bumper of the truck parked like a parasite on his land. The chain clanged alive, every link tightening with a message more eloquent than any speech. The truck, symbol of arrogance, had just been claimed by a man who refused to bow. The silence broke, but not with voices, with the sound of tractor ignition. Grandpa climbed onto the old machine sitting by the field's edge, its paint faded, its age obvious, but its strength still undeniable. The family's hearts pounded as the engine coughed once, twice, and then roared with raw power. That roar was not a machine's, it was justice waking. Across the fence line, neighbors had gathered, drawn by instinct, sensing the air had turned electric. They leaned on posts, clutched phones, whispering, "What's he doing? Is he really?" Their voices trailed off when they saw the chain stretching between tractor and truck like a steel umbilical cord, binding arrogance to destiny. For one charged moment, everything stood still. The imposter swallowed hard, realization dawning too late. His boots shifted nervously. His jaw opened with protests he hadn't yet formed. The family, friends, the neighbors, even the field itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, Grandpa pressed forward. The chain groaned, rattled, then snapped taut with a metallic cry. The false officer whirled, yelling, "Hey! Hey! You can't! This is criminal! This is—" His words drowned in the grind of tractor wheels biting into the soil. Slowly, like a verdict being read, the truck jolted forward. Its tires slipped in the dirt, spinning helplessly. Its arrogant stance faltered, dragged not by indignation, but by undeniable power tethered to something real. The family gasped first, then laughed in nervous disbelief. Neighbors pulled out cell phones. Cameras recorded the duel not as shouting, matches on paper, but as a physical act of metaphor. Across imaginary platforms, an imagined chorus rose, "Creek Justice." They dragged fake authority into the mud. This is what dignity looks like. What began as one man's stand was already transforming into legend, ready to be clipped, shared, memed, and reposted. Under the strain, the truck jerked, shuddered, and obeyed. Every inch it slid was another insult erased. Every foot forward was a revelation, false authority being unmasked, its power proven hollow. The sunglasses man ran alongside, shouting, waving arms that once gestured with borrowed power but now flailed with panic. His clipboard slipped from his hand, its papers scattering into the air, meaningless confetti of false laws shredded by the wind. Grandpa's tractor strained but steady, pulling like a relic of older truths. That strength lives in persistence, that power earned from labor cannot be undone by arrogance. Dust flew in great clouds. Voices from the sidelines swelled into a chorus of cheers and laughter, and then the chain delivered its final sentence, tugging truck and trespasser to the edge of the creek. The front wheels dipped first. Water splashed, sputtering against chrome. The panicked shouts of the imposter turned to sputters of desperation. He stumbled, half in the mud, soaked in the folly of his own self-importance. The smug mask cracked completely. What stood there was not authority, but exposure. The spectators erupted. To the family, it was vindication. To the neighbors, it was theater. And to the broader imagination, it became a parable. Power, when false, cannot withstand true resolve. Not against men like Grandpa who held silence until it had to thunder. Grandpa never gloated, never shouted in victory. He only pulled the tractor to a stop, killed the engine, and sat in stillness, while the creek swallowed arrogance whole. His face carried no smirk, only a firm steadiness, as if this had not been retaliation, but restoration. The imposter scrambled, mud caked across his knees, water dripping into his shoes. The truck sputtered uselessly, choked by its own hubris. The man who had moments before declared himself judge now looked like a child caught playing pretend with grown men's tools. His title, his rules, his fantasy authority, all of it washed, downstream with the current. The onlookers knew they had witnessed more than one man teaching another a lesson. They had seen falsehood dragged into the light and dignity drive it there. For every community brutalized by those who fake authority, for every outsider demeaned by hollow power, this creek became proof that truth, patient, dignified truth, would not be drowned. Grandpa dismounted the tractor slowly, boots crunching gravel, tipping his hat against the fading sun. He said nothing, but his silence shouted louder than the engine had. It said, "This is ours. This has been earned." And no man with a badge of his own invention can take it. Neighbors would replay it endlessly, some swearing they'd never forget the clang of chain tightening, others insisting the splash of the creek still echoed in their ears. Online, memes sprouted overnight. Tractors towing arrogance, captions declaring authority washed away. Families watching from their couches laughed, cheered, and felt pride swelling in their chests. Justice here wasn't written in statutes. It was lived in action. And somewhere within that ordinary day turned extraordinary, the family understood what they had witnessed wasn't only Grandpa's act. It was a generational statement. Dignity stands. Arrogance falls. And sometimes chains and tractors write the clearest verdicts of all. But the story didn't end in the creek. The aftermath would ripple far beyond those ranch fences. Long after, the roar of the tractor faded, and the creek swallowed the last sputter of the intruder's truck. The story found new life. What began as dirt and chains on a ranch became digital lightning on screens across the country. The neighbors had filmed everything, and within hours, clips were bouncing through group chats, populating feeds, and exploding across platforms. The first shaky video opened with the shout of the fake officer. "This isn't negotiable!" It cut suddenly to Grandpa's tractor, the chain tightening, the crowd gasping. By the time the truck splashed into the creek, viewers were already on their feet in living rooms, coffee shops, and campus halls shouting, "Yes!" Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. Creek Justice. Shot to local trending within an afternoon. Grandpa Strong wasn't far behind. Within days, the EV videos had accumulated thousands, then millions of views. On one viral clip, the top comment read, "This wasn't about a truck. This was about all of us being told we don't belong, and finally saying, enough." Another echoed the sentiment. That chain carried every insult, every unnecessary rule, every invented authority we've had to swallow, and it dragged them straight into the mud. Memes flooded timelines. Cartoons showed tractors hauling away clipboards labeled fake power. Photoshops depicted creeks swallowing entire bureaucracies. Grandpa's face, calm and unsmiling, was edited into posters like a folk hero. 1. Rays of sunlight crowned the brim of his weathered hat, the caption declaring, "True authority doesn't shout, it acts." But beyond the comedy and catharsis, something deeper stirred. Commentators seized on the symbolism. A single elder farmer proving that when false power overreaches, dignity and persistence can uproot it. Political bloggers wrote essays framing the event as a universal parable about community pushback against arrogance. The fake HOA cop, one article argued, isn't just one man. He's every system that tells ordinary people they must comply with nonsense designed only to remind them of their place. And Grandpa? He's the spirit of working class. Endurance that refuses to bow. Calls poured in from local radio talk shows. "I saw myself in that tractor," one caller said, "because I've watched so-called managers talk down to immigrants at work like they're less. And seeing that truck dragged into the creek felt like watching all that arrogance finally sink." On online forums, users from across backgrounds, immigrants, first-generation kids, farm workers, warehouse employees, shared their own experiences of being told they didn't measure up. They repeated the same refrain. Grandpa had stood for them all. The story even nudged at mainstream headlines. Cable commentators played the footage as human interest filler, chuckling at the theatrics, but missing the deeper resonance. Yet, in certain corners of the internet, the symbolism burned brighter. Political channels framed it as a battle between authentic people and bureaucrats who invent rules to mask their lack of real power. An editorial posted on one progressive site summed it plainly. A tractor dragging a truck might be literal, but it's also a metaphor the country desperately needed. For the family, the response was overwhelming. Grandkids scrolled through, posts filled with strangers praising their grandfather as a hero. Young neighbors filmed TikToks outside the fence line, narrating the legend of the creek. And through it all, Grandpa himself didn't change. He neither basked in attention nor diminished his act. He stayed steady, feeding livestock at dawn, repairing fence posts, carrying himself as he always had. Except now, his silence felt even heavier, as if more people were learning how to listen to it. Still, those ripples refused to calm. Young activists picked up the story as a rallying image. To them, Grandpa wasn't just an old man with a tractor. He was evidence that quiet resistance can still upend bluster. They tagged posts, "Be someone's grandpa in a world of fake cops." The ranch itself became a symbol, proof that dignity rooted in labor and community cannot be bulldozed by arrogance dressed up as law. And yet, away from memes and hashtags, those who had stood by the creek that day spoke of something subtler, something the videos couldn't quite capture. They spoke of the tension in the silence before the tractor moved, the way every onlooker unconsciously held their breath, as though history itself was about to turn. That moment was not just spectacle. It was revelation, a surge of clarity that all at once exposed falsehoods and confirmed truths people already felt in their bones. In kitchens and coffee shops, people spoke with relief. Finally, they said, someone showed them. A farmer laughed on a podcast. It takes an elder with a tractor to remind everyone that dignity doesn't ask for permission. And in immigrant households, mothers and fathers smiled knowingly. At the screens, they understood too well the balance between endurance and defiance. The fake officer's arrogance sank that day, but what stayed afloat was larger than one man. It was a lesson, retold, reframed, shared, until it outgrew the aid moment itself, and like ripples across water, it widened beyond fences, beyond counties, beyond politics. And in the silence that followed the storm, Grandpa's lesson began to shine. In the days that followed, the world around the ranch buzzed with stories, jokes, and memes. But inside the family home, Grandpa remained the same. Quiet, composed, feeding animals at dawn, mending tools in the afternoon, tipping his hat to neighbors on evening walks. To him, the creekside spectacle wasn't an eruption of temper. It wasn't revenge. It was principle. And when neighbors asked why he'd done it, he gave them the same answer every time. You don't let lies take root on your land. Not here, not ever. His voice carried no bitterness because the act hadn't sprung from anger. It had sprung from a conviction steady as barbed wire wrapped tight around a pasture, that the land meant something deeper than dirt. To Grandpa, land was memory. It was belonging. It was proof that his family, descended from immigrants who had once been told they weren't welcome, had carved a rightful place under the same sky as anyone else. When the fake officer fabricated rules, it wasn't bureaucracy. It was erasure. And Grandpa couldn't allow erasure. He explained it to his grandchildren at the kitchen table one evening, his voice carrying low and firm. That tractor, that chain, that creek, they weren't about punishing a man. They were about showing you all something bigger. Never give anyone the right to tell you that you don't belong on ground you've worked for, ground you've cared for, ground you've earned. The lesson echoed across identities. Dignity is not some abstract prize, it is lived in daily work. For immigrant families, it sprouts in gardens tilled after dawn shifts. For laborers, it grows in calloused hands gripping steering wheels of trucks or forklifts. For every community told, they must shrink themselves to fit into rules never written. For them, dignity stands taller than any false authority. The fake cop's arrogance was loud, but loudness is not power. What Grandpa proved was that true authority doesn't shout, it acts. Independence doesn't rest in regulations or paper decrees written without your consent. Independence is standing firm, even when silence feels like surrender, until the you moment arrives when silence must become action. And courage, Grandpa showed, is not born of fury, but of clarity. He didn't drag the truck because he hated the man. He did it because he loved the principle that no person, no clipboard, no false badge will ever outweigh the dignity of work, sacrifice, and belonging. If arrogance builds castles of sand, courage is simply the tide that washes them away. The family absorbed his quiet teachings in newfound ways after the creek. His grandchildren understood with fresh clarity that those fence posts they had grumbled about helping replace weren't just wood and wire. They were markers of sovereignty. His children realized that their father's silence at council meetings, his restraint in the face of patronizing smiles, wasn't weakness. It was strategy, the patience that waits until action will matter most. All around, people who had never set foot on the ranch began to see themselves in the act. A warehouse worker 1,000 miles away watched the video during a lunch break and whispered, "That's my grandpa." A nurse wrote online, "When he pulled that truck, I thought about every time a manager dismissed my accent, and I felt vindicated." The meaning leapt beyond one fence line. It became everyone's story. Grandpa's tractor did not only drag metal into water, it dragged fear into defeat. It showed that reclamation of justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it comes from elders with quiet eyes, from chains pulled taut, from actions that cut through arrogance more clearly than speeches ever could. Sometimes it comes from standing on your own ground and saying without saying, "Enough." And that's why this ranch story doesn't just belong to one family. It belongs to every voice that refuses to be silenced. It began with a truck and a man pretending to carry authority, a clipboard full of empty rules, and a smug belief that one family would bow to intimidation. And it ended with that same truck, sinking into a creek, its false power dragged down link by link, its arrogance dissolved in water and mud. Fake HOA cop kept parking on our ranch, so Grandpa chained their truck and dragged it into the creek. The story loops back to its title, not as a headline, but as a parable. Arrogance fell, and dignity rose. What happened on that ranch was more than stubborn resistance. It was a universal story of what happens when false authority collides with earned independence, when loud pretenders meet quiet resilience. It told every worker dismissed, every immigrant told they didn't belong, every community mocked by fabricated standards. Your dignity is stronger than their posturing. Your chains aren't for tethering you down. Your chains are for pulling lies into the creek. Grandpa never raised his voice. He never needed to. Instead, he acted in the way. Dignity always acts when pushed too far. Simple, unshakable, undeniable. And that is the lesson left behind for all of us. Resist arrogance. Stand firm in your stories. Reclaim the land of your life, brick by brick, acre by acre, chain by chain. Carry the parable. Share it. live it. Because justice doesn't only flow from podiums or courtrooms, it can ripple outward from porches, pastures, and creeks. Because in the end, the loudest chains are the ones that break the silence of intimidation.